There are two kinds of family stories. The kind where someone does something wrong and everyone knows it and says so. And the kind where someone does something wrong and everyone knows it and nobody says anything at all because saying it out loud would cost too much. My family was the second kind. We had been the second kind my entire life. I was 62 years old before I understood that silence isn't the same as peace. It just means the thing you're not saying has more room to grow. My name is Aurelia Stoddard, and I am 63 years old, and I want to tell you about the year my grandmother died and what happened after, because what happened after is the thing that matters. Not the grief. Not the funeral. Not the casseroles on the kitchen counter, or the strangers who shook my hand at the reception and said they were sorry for my loss. What matters is the document I found 3 months later in a manila envelope at the bottom of a cardboard box that had been labeled, in my mother's handwriting, miscellaneous, Doris estate. What matters is that my signature was on it. And I had never held that pen. My grandmother's name was Doris Calder, and she was the person in my family who saw me clearly. That is the simplest way I know to say it. She had lived her whole adult life in Millhaven, a town of 4,000 people in central Ohio with 2 traffic lights and a grain elevator you could see for 7 miles. She had raised 4 children in the house on Calder Road. She had buried my grandfather. She had kept a kitchen garden until she was 81 and her knees wouldn't allow it anymore, and even then she kept the copper kettle on the back burner and the Earl Grey tin on the second shelf, and she made tea every afternoon at 2 o'clock. Without fail, and she always made 2 cups. The second cup was for whoever showed up. I showed up as often as I could. I lived 4 hours away in Columbus, where I had worked for 22 years as a property assessor for the county, a job that sounds dry and probably is dry, but that I was good at, and that required me to be careful about what I could prove and what I could only suspect. That turned out to be useful. My mother, her name is Constance, Connie to her friends, though I have always called her Mom out of habit, is the eldest of Doris's 4 children. My Uncle Gerald is second. My Aunt Ruth is third. My Uncle Pete is youngest. They are all alive. They were all present at the reading of the will. My grandmother had an estate of modest size and significant sentimental weight. The house on Calder Road. A savings account at First National of Millhaven with $183,417.52 in it. A certificate of deposit for $44,600. A second savings account containing $12,281 that she had labeled in her own handwritten ledger, kept in the kitchen drawer, as for Aurelia, no strings. A hand-drawn quilt her own grandmother had made. The cedar box where she kept my grandfather's letters. The copper kettle, which I know sounds like nothing, but which Doris had specified by name in a handwritten addendum to the will. The will was read 6 weeks after her funeral. My mother was executor. I found out 9 days after the reading that the $44,600 certificate of deposit had been liquidated 14 months before my grandmother died, while she was in the memory care unit at Millhaven Pines and was, by the clinical assessment of 3 separate physicians, no longer legally competent to manage her own finances. I found out 3 months after the reading that the $12,281 account labeled for Aurelia, no strings, had been transferred, in full, to my mother's personal checking account 11 days before Doris died. And I found out on a Thursday evening in October, sitting on the floor of my spare bedroom surrounded by estate boxes, that there was a document, a power of attorney amendment, dated 22 months before my grandmother's death, bearing what was supposed to be my signature as a witness, alongside my mother's name as the sole authorized agent of Doris Calder's financial affairs. I had never seen that document before. I sat with it in my hands for a long time. The spare bedroom was cold. I had not turned the heat on yet because it was only October, and I am stubborn about things like that. The single lamp on the floor made a circle of yellow light. I remember the way the paper felt. Thick, official, with the raised seal of a notary from Millhaven. I remember the sound of the furnace clicking in the basement. I remember thinking that my handwriting is nothing like that. My R's don't loop. My A is open at the top. This was someone else's hand making a fair copy of what my signature was supposed to look like, and not doing it very well. I set the paper down on the carpet. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I did not do anything for the next 47 minutes except sit in that cold room and think. I should tell you something about my mother. This is the part of the story I have taken the longest time to understand, and I don't want to tell it wrong. Constance Stoddard. She kept my father's name after he left, for reasons I was too young to question at the time. Grew up in a household where money meant safety and the absence of money meant danger. Her father, my grandfather Earl, was a good man but an unreliable earner. There were years when the house on Calder Road was warm and years when it wasn't. There were Christmases with gifts and Christmases without. My grandmother Doris managed all of it with what I can only call a kind of steady grace, working the night shift at the textile mill for 11 years while also raising 4 children, and she never made anyone feel poor, which is its own kind of extraordinary talent. But my mother felt it. She felt every lean year. She felt every time a school friend had something she didn't. She grew up with a relationship to money that I would describe now as desperate, not greedy in the way people usually mean that word, but frightened. Genuinely frightened. Money was the thing that stood between her and the years when there wasn't enough, and she never stopped being afraid of not having it. I think that's why she did what she did. I'm not saying it excuses it. I'm saying I understand where the impulse was born, in a child who watched her mother work double shifts and learned that money could disappear without warning, and decided, somewhere deep in herself, that she would never let that happen to her again. Not even if it meant taking what wasn't hers. Not even if it meant forging her daughter's name on a legal document. The fear in her was old. It was older than me. That doesn't make what she did to Doris right. That doesn't make what she did to me right. But it gives it a shape I can hold without it destroying me. I called my friend Patricia the next morning. Patricia Gaines. We have worked in the same county building for 16 years. She in deed records, me in property assessment, and she is the most useful person I know in crisis because she does not dramatize. She drinks black coffee, and she says exactly what she thinks. Bring me the paper, she said, when I told her what I'd found. I drove to her house on a Saturday with the document in a manila folder. She put on her reading glasses and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "This isn't your signature." I know. You need an attorney. I know. Not one for Millhaven. I know. She looked at me over her glasses. Do you know an attorney, or do you want me to find you one? I let her find me one. Her name was Sandra Kowalczyk, and she practiced in Columbus, and her focus was estate law and fiduciary litigation. I met her the following Thursday. She had an office that smelled like coffee and old carpet, a desk stacked with color-coded files, and a very specific way of listening. Very still, pen in hand, not writing yet, just watching my face while I talked. I spread everything I had on her desk. The document. A copy of Doris's actual will. The handwritten ledger from the kitchen drawer, which Patricia had helped me photograph before I returned it to the estate boxes. The bank statements I had obtained through a records request, which showed the liquidation of the CD and the transfer of the for Aurelia account. The clinical assessments from the memory care unit, dated from that same 22-month period. Sandra read everything. She took 22 minutes. I sat in the chair across from her and drank water from a paper cup and looked at the framed certificate on the wall, her law degree, night school, the year written in gold ink. When she finished, she set down her pen and said, "She didn't just manage the estate wrong. She forged legal documents while your grandmother was legally incompetent and used them to redirect estate assets. That's fraud." I said, "I know. Do you want to report it, or do you want to recover the assets?" "Both," I said. She nodded once, like that was the right answer. "Give me 2 weeks." The 2 weeks she asked for stretched to 3, and those 3 weeks were the hardest part. Not because of doubt. I didn't doubt what I was doing. I had stood in too many properties in my working life and watched what happened when someone looked the other way at a fraudulent title transfer, when they told themselves it was family, when they decided the cost of clarity was too high. I knew what happened. The thing didn't get better. It got bigger. What was hard was the ordinary days. Getting up in the morning and making coffee and going to work and looking at property records and coming home in the evening and feeding my cat, his name was Bernard, a gray tabby of emphatic opinions, and trying to sleep. Knowing that my mother was 4 hours away in Millhaven, living in the house on Calder Road that she had inherited as executor, drinking her own tea in her own kitchen, and had no idea what was coming. One evening, it was a Thursday, 3 days before Sandra called me. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad and went through the numbers. Not for the first time, but this time I wrote them down in a column. The CD, $44,600. The for Aurelia account, $12,281. My estimated share of residual estate assets, based on the will as originally written, $31,847.22. Total, $88,728.22. I sat there with that number for a while. Bernard climbed onto the table and stepped directly onto the legal pad, which he did whenever I was doing something he disapproved of, and I moved him off and he came back, and eventually I let him stay. The thing about working with numbers for 22 years is that they don't feel like much when you look at them. They're just amounts. They don't carry the weight of the copper kettle or the cedar box. They don't carry the weight of Doris making 2 cups of tea every afternoon in case someone showed up. They don't carry any of it. But they're what you can prove. And proof is the only thing that holds in a room where nobody wants to say what they know. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about one thing, and it was this. My mother had signed my name. She had stood somewhere, in front of a notary, in some office in Millhaven, and she had written what was supposed to be my signature on a document that would give her complete control of my grandmother's affairs. She had thought about my handwriting and tried to copy it. She had decided that was acceptable. She had decided I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't care, or wouldn't do anything about it if I did. That part 1 kept turning over. Not the money. The decision that I wouldn't matter. Sandra called on a Tuesday at 8:13 in the morning. I was already at my desk at work. "I've filed the fraud complaint with the probate court," she said. "I've also filed a petition to reopen the estate. There's a parallel civil filing for recovery of the diverted assets. The court will send notice to all parties of interest, which includes your mother as executor and your Uncle Gerald and Aunt Ruth as named beneficiaries." "When will she receive it?" "Notices typically go out within 10 to 14 business days. She'll receive it by mail." I said, "All right." "There's one more thing. The notary on the power of attorney document. I ran his license. He surrendered it voluntarily in 2021. 2 years after your grandmother signed the original will. I'm reporting the discrepancy to the county." I said, "All right," again. I realized I had been holding a pen and pressing it against my desk hard enough to leave a mark in the wood. I set it down. "Aurelia," Sandra said, "you did the right thing." "I know," I said. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It rarely does." The notice arrived at my mother's house on a Thursday. I know this because my Aunt Ruth called me at 6:47 that evening. Ruth is the 3rd child, the quiet one, the one who has always watched more than she talked. She called from her car, which meant she didn't want Gerald to hear. "Your mother got something from the probate court today," she said. "I know." A long pause. "Did you file that?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Aurelia," she said. She stopped. Started again. "Your mother she's not taking it well." "I imagine she isn't. She's been trying to call you." "I know. I've seen the calls." 11 of them by that point. I hadn't answered any of them. Ruth said, quietly, "What she did was wrong. I want you to know that I know that. I've known for a while that something wasn't right with the estate, and I didn't say anything, and I'm sorry for that." I had not expected that. I sat with it for a moment. "Thank you for saying so," I said. "Is there anything I can do?" "Let Sandra Kowalczyk handle it," I said. "Don't talk to Mom about the specifics. Don't try to broker anything. Just let the process run." Ruth said she understood. She sounded relieved to have been given a clear instruction. Some people are like that. They want to do the right thing, but they need someone to show them where the door is. We talked for a few more minutes about things that had nothing to do with the estate. Her younger son was starting his 2nd year of teaching. Her garden had done well this summer. She had been meaning to call me for months, just to catch up, she said, and hadn't. I told her I knew what that was like. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a while with the lamp on and Bernard asleep on the chair across from me. The Earl Grey tin was on the counter. I had taken it from the estate boxes, one of the things specifically mentioned in the will's personal property list, copper kettle and cedar box and Earl Grey tin, and they had all ended up with me eventually, though it took Sandra 3 additional weeks and a formal inventory request to get the cedar box. My mother had wanted to keep it. I made tea. I sat with it. I thought about Doris, who had always made 2 cups. My mother called 31 times in the 2 weeks after the notice arrived. Answered on the 18th call, on a Sunday afternoon, because I had decided I was ready. "You filed a complaint against me," she said. Her voice was shaking. Not with sadness, I thought, but with something harder to name. Outrage, maybe. Or fear, wearing outrageous clothes. "Yes," I said. "I'm your mother." "I know. That money, Aurelia, your grandmother wanted me to have. She told me she wanted." "Mom." I said it once, not loud. She wrote it in the ledger. In her own handwriting. For Aurelia, no strings. And she wrote it before she went into memory care. Before she couldn't have written anything coherent. We both know that. Silence. "The CD was for the estate," I said. "The power of attorney amendment that has my name on it, I never signed it. You know I never signed it. The notary who stamped it lost his license 2 years after the fact. Sandra has all of it. So, you're going to take me to court." Her voice had changed. Something in it that sounded, underneath everything else, like she already knew how this was going to go. "The court is already involved," I said. "I'm not doing anything more than what I've already done. Sandra will handle the process. You need to get your own attorney. Aurelia, I am your mother. I raised you. I know you did. I need you to drop this." I had thought about what I would say to this. I had thought about it for 3 weeks. I had written it down on the legal pad, and read it back to myself and revised it twice, and in the end I had put the legal pad away because I didn't want to read from a script. I wanted to know it well enough to say it plainly. "I love you," I said. "That hasn't changed. But Grandma Doris set that money aside for me. She wrote my name on it. She chose that. And what you did erased her choice as well as mine. I'm not dropping it. I'm not angry. I'm just not dropping it." My mother started to speak and I said, gently, "You need an attorney. I mean that in the most practical way I can say it. Please get one." She hung up. I set the phone down on the table. Bernard appeared from somewhere and butted his head against my hand, which he did when the room had been loud, and then went quiet. I scratched behind his ears. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was going flat and gray, the way it does in Columbus in the late afternoon, and the Earl Grey tin caught what was left of it on the second shelf. I thought Doris would have made tea. So I did. The probate process took 7 months. I will not describe all 7 months in detail because most of it was paperwork and waiting and periodic calls from Sandra updating me on filings and responses and motions, and none of that is the story. The story is what happened inside me during those 7 months, which was quieter than I expected. My Uncle Gerald called once, early on, and was angry in a way that felt borrowed, like someone had told him to be angry on their behalf, and he was doing his best. I listened and did not argue and told him, as I had told Ruth, to let the process run. He did not call again. Ruth called occasionally with updates from Millhaven, not about the case but about the ordinary things. My mother had hired an attorney named Richard Elms, who was local and experienced, Sandra said, though she said it in a tone that suggested he was experienced in the kind of way that wouldn't help much here. My mother had stopped going to her Wednesday bridge club. She had also, according to Ruth, begun telling a version of events in which she had merely been trying to protect the estate from my interference, which was creative. I did not engage with any of it. In January, during the coldest week of the year, I drove to Millhaven for the first time since the funeral. Not to see my mother. I went to the county records office to pull some historical property records that Sandra had requested, and while I was there I drove out to Calder Road and sat in my car for a while in front of the house. It looked the same. The kitchen garden was covered in snow. The light was on in the front room. I thought about all the Saturdays I had driven 4 hours to sit at that kitchen table and drink tea and talk to a woman who thought I was worth seeing clearly. I thought about the copper kettle and the way it made a specific sound when the water was ready. I thought about the cedar box and the letters inside, My grandfather's handwriting on thin paper, the kind of thin that happens to old paper that's been kept in a dry place and handled with care. I did not get out of the car. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I drove back to Columbus. Some goodbyes are quiet. Some of them, you don't even know you're saying until you're already on the highway. Sandra called in April with the settlement terms. My mother's attorney had, she said, been pragmatic once the evidence was fully in front of him. There was no realistic defense for the signature. There was no realistic defense for the CD liquidation during the incompetency period. The settlement required repayment of the $12,281 to my designated account, a negotiated distribution of the remaining estate assets consistent with the original will. My share came to $31,847.22, as I had calculated, and a formal acknowledgement of unauthorized management of the estate during the period in question. No criminal charges were filed. That was my choice. Sandra had said, early on, that the fraud complaint to the probate court was the mechanism and that a criminal referral was possible but not certain, and asked me what outcome I was looking for. I told her I wanted the money restored and the record corrected. I told her I didn't want my mother to go to prison. I told her those were the two things. She had made both of them happen. The check for $12,281 arrived in my account on a Friday morning. I looked at the notification on my phone. I was at work. I put the phone back in my pocket and finished the assessment I was doing, which was a 3-bedroom colonial on the east side that had recently had a kitchen renovation, and I wrote my notes and closed the file and drove home. On the counter was the Earl Grey tin. The copper kettle was on the stove. The cedar box was on the shelf in the spare bedroom, next to the framed certificate from my night school property law course, and inside it were my grandfather's letters, which I had read twice and then put away because they were his to keep, and I was only the person who got to hold them now. I made tea. I sat at the table. I thought about all the things I had not done during those 7 months. I had not cried in front of my mother. I had not threatened her. I had not called Gerald and argued. I had not drafted letters I didn't send, which is something I used to do in other hard years. Draft the letter, read it back, never send it. This time I hadn't even written the letter. There had been nothing to say that the paperwork didn't say better. Some people will tell you that the quiet way is the cold way. That doing things through attorneys and courts instead of at the kitchen table means you've stopped loving someone. I don't think that's true. I think sometimes the loudest thing you can do for the people you love is refuse to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I think sometimes the most loving thing available to you is accuracy. Doris wrote my name in her ledger. In her own handwriting. She chose me. I showed up for her choice. My mother and I have not spoken since that Sunday afternoon call. It has now been 14 months. Ruth calls occasionally. She says my mother is well, which I take to mean she is not unwell, which is what I hoped for. Gerald sends a Christmas card every year with a form letter inside, and I send one back. I see a therapist named Dr. Mariela Fuentes, who has an office in Clintonville and a way of asking questions that makes you answer them honestly before you've decided whether you meant to. She asked me once, in one of our early sessions, what I was most afraid would happen when I filed those papers. I said I was afraid I would end it. The family, whatever we had left. She asked me what I thought we had left at that point. I didn't have a good answer. I still don't, entirely. But I think what I have now is something I can hold honestly. A family that is smaller than it was. A mother I love and keep at a distance. A house I drive past and don't stop at, and a copper kettle on my stove and 2 cups of tea every afternoon at 2 o'clock, because old habits of people we love deserve to keep living somewhere. I keep thinking about what Doris knew. She was a woman who had watched her own family manage money and silence and loyalty in all the complicated ways that families do, and at the end of her life, she had written one line in a kitchen ledger in her own careful hand. For Aurelia, no strings. No strings. 2 words. The simplest possible instruction. She had known someone would try to complicate it. She had known the strings would come from somewhere because they always do. And she had tried, with what she had, to cut them before they were tied. I try to live up to that. I try to be the kind of person who keeps it simple, who doesn't pretend that what happened differently, who shows up for the people who chose her, and who makes 2 cups of tea just in case. Some kindnesses are loans the lender forgets they're keeping. My grandmother remembered every gift she gave. She kept a ledger. A family will tell you blood is thicker than water until the day blood asks them to give something up. I stopped being surprised by that. I just stopped being there when it happened. Love that demands you shrink is not love. It is management. And when you understand that, you understand what you're actually being offered. The cost of keeping the peace in a house, where peace means being the smallest person in the room, is your whole life. I paid that cost for a long time. At 62, I stopped. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. Compassion is not a key to my front door. I hold all 3 of those things about my mother, and she lives 4 hours away, and that is not cruelty. That is the shape of what's left, and shapes are not nothing. Losing an illusion is still better than living inside one. I think about you sometimes, the person listening to this, and I wonder if you have a ledger in your own family. Something written down somewhere in someone's careful hand, an instruction meant for you, that someone else decided to complicate. I wonder if you have a signature that someone else signed. Not necessarily a real one. I mean the version where someone decides what you would have chosen on your behalf, without asking. If someone in your life has been deciding what you would have chosen, deciding your place, deciding your portion, deciding that you would not notice or would not act, what would it mean for you to walk into your own version of that courthouse and file what needs to be filed? What would it cost you? And what, in the long quiet afterward, might you finally get to keep?